On the one hand, that. On the other hand, that if it's a very small museum, it isn't economic for it to run a cafe or a shop. So it puts itself in a very difficult position. On the one hand, it must do something. On the other hand, it can't do it. And the museums which are succeeding of the smaller museums are the ones that achieve the impossible. I've got the happiest memories of Argenta, and for one special reason. I was given a most magnificent lunch by the mayor. And I'm a very simple man. Anybody who gives me a good meal is automatically a good man. Anybody who gives me no meal at all or a bad meal is automatically a bad man. And I was given a wonderful meal in Argenta, and so I got very happy memories of the town. I've also got very happy memories of the district and the variety of the environmental beauties of the district. So I'm sure you're having your conference in absolutely the right place. Now, in a sense, I've known about eco-museums for far too long. It's rather as if an early Christian were to be brought into the modern world and asked what he thought of the Christian church today. I'm bound to make comparisons between what I feel the eco-museum was in its beginnings, in its sort of primitive beauty, and what it seems to be today. But you must forgive that. That happens to anyone who has been with something for a very long time. Now, eco-museums first came into my world in the mid-1960s, when the museum at Le Creusot had just been established by those two very great people, Georges-Henri Rivière and Hugues de Varine. They were the true pioneers, the early Christians, if you like, the first disciples of the eco-museums. And I learnt all my original gospel concerning eco-museums from them. And I very well remember how they explained to me that the whole principle of the eco-museum was that it was a double input museum. That's to say, you had an input from the local people, and you had another input from the professionals who were theoretically in charge. And without the double input, the thing wouldn't work. Now, at that time, and it's easy to forget this, Le Creusot was in a very difficult situation. There was tremendous unemployment there because the great Schneider factory, which had made weapons for the French government and also for the Germans, had been closed down in disgrace. The Schneider family had been banished from controlling it. There was enormous unemployment. And the whole point of the Eco-Museum was to find something that would allow the local people to take a pride in their own past and to take a new pride in the district. Now that situation has now gone because new industries have been brought into Le Creusot, and you don't have the same need for this type of museum. But at the same time, the character of the museum has enormously changed. I remember the first director at Le Creusot, and was a great friend of mine called Marcel Evrard, saying to me that everything within this very big area around Le Creusot, which formed the area of the Eco-Museum, was part of the museum. Every tree, every cow, every person was an object in the museum. And he said to me, and I've never forgotten the remark, I myself am an object in my own museum. So he didn't distinguish between what he was looking after and what he was as a person. But one also has to remember that this was a museum that came out of a new philosophy for French museums. Before it was called an eco-museum, it was called a musée éclaté. That's to say, a museum which had burst its walls, which had come from inside the limitations and boundaries of a building. And it was a very good phrase, the musée éclaté. I took to it very much, the exploded museum, if you like. And the Eco-Museum came only a little later. Now, this idea that a museum didn't have to be in a building, at that time, in the mid-1960s, was a very new idea. It was a revolutionary idea and a very important one. Now, you didn't have to own all the things in the museum. In fact, they didn't own them at Le Creusot. Some of them they did. But all the farms and the little factories and the tile works and that sort of thing, They were within the area of the museum, but the museum didn't necessarily own them, they didn't control them. And in order to make the museum work, you had to have the support of the local people. You had to have it for two reasons. Partly because they were part of the museum, and partly because you didn't have the money to produce results except by using them as volunteers. It was a museum which made tremendous use of volunteers. Now, I wouldn't go so far as to say what has happened since then, since the mid-1960s, has been the debasement and the degradation of the eco-museum idea, but what I would certainly say is that it has very much changed. In the beginning, the official museum world, especially in France, where the museum world is very centralized, or certainly was, there was great suspicion of Le Creusot. They couldn't control it, it didn't follow the usual rules, it didn't employ only professionals, so it was a danger to employment among museum people. And particularly, it didn't seem to have any theory which corresponded to what they already knew. And so there was a considerable movement in France to, if I said to control the museum, Eco-Museum at Le Creusot, that's rather too strong, but anyway, to try and bring it more into the main field of museum thinking and practice. Now, to some extent, they succeeded. That is to say that eventually the director disappeared, the staff changed completely. But during a golden period, let us say it lasted until the mid-1970s, so about 10 years, Le Creusot was a great place of pilgrimage for museum people from all over the world, rather like Ironbridge was in England, who came in order to see a new experiment, mostly anxious to see it working, but in some cases anxious to see it failing because it didn't follow the rules. Now, in some ways, the decay at Le Creusot was inevitable, because as new jobs came into the area, the local people didn't have the same need for something to compensate for the terrible conditions that were there in the years immediately after the war. But as well as that, the difficulty was, and this is the second big factor in the growth of eco-museums, that you didn't need to rely so much on local people. That is to say, the municipality, the local organization around Le Creusot, was willing to put money into Le Creusot, and so was the central government in Paris, as a means of improving the morale of the people in and around Le Creusot. And that gradually disappeared, so there was a financial crisis at Le Creusot, which meant that they had to put an emphasis on different things. And what has happened roughly with eco-museums, particularly in France, because one must remember that the eco-museum was a child of France. It was born in France. Most of the eco-museums in Europe are in France, not all. And there was a pressure on it, I can't put it any stronger than that, there was a pressure on it to try and do something to, if I said modernize the eco-museum, perhaps that's what I should say, but that involved trying to make it more attractive to tourists, to people who didn't live in the area. And that inevitably meant to change it. Now, I think this is the point to say that the idea of the eco-museum has never really proved appealing in Great Britain. There's partly the name. The name was felt to be foreign, and particularly French. If it was French, then it must be dangerous. And so you tended not to want to adopt the name Eco-Museum. And we have one or two museums in Great Britain which are very similar to the original type of eco-museum. One of them is the one in Cornwall that you heard about at this conference already, and we have Stuart Smith, who runs it, here with you to talk about it. But in general, the idea hasn't caught on. It hasn't caught on for one particular reason. The name was felt to be prestigious. There were a great many open-air museums by the 1970s, and there were even more by the 1980s, everywhere in Europe. And a lot of museums that were really no more than open-air museums began to call themselves eco-museums. Now, in some ways, that was a very dangerous thing to happen, because the essence of an eco-museum is that you are trying to explain what is already there on its original site. The essence of an open-air museum is that you bring things to a central site from all over the place, not necessarily in the same district. So an eco-museum and an open-air museum are not the same thing, and the confusion between them has not been a good thing, in my opinion. And I'd like to explain why. You see, this original idea of the double input, of local people being vital to the museum, was not very popular with the museum profession. It was difficult to organize because volunteers are always difficult to organize. But beyond that, it was felt to be in some vague way unprofessional. And this attempt to professionalize the eco-museum has been a constant source of argument and, in some cases, very bad feeling. If you take a museum in Europe a long way away from the Creusot, the one in central Sweden, which is a true eco-museum, which is based on a very large area of the old iron and steel industry in Sweden, that is a true eco-museum because it contains many separate sites. Each site is controlled or at any rate inspired by local people. It couldn't function without their help and without their hard work. And so this is a true eco-museum. But you can take others that equally obviously are not true eco-museums. If you take the ones in France, you can take, for example, the one at Rennes, which I would not call a true eco-museum, although it does call itself an eco-museum. It's essentially a museum about farming and horticulture within the area, but it is about something. It doesn't spring directly from it. So many things have been brought into it in order to illustrate the points being made that one has to be not insulting and say it isn't an eco-museum, because that wouldn't be true. But you have to say that it doesn't correspond to the original idea of an eco-museum. The Museum of the Camargue, down in the south, is closer to the idea of an eco-museum, but it too has had great financial difficulties, and all the time the need to attract visitors from outside the area, particularly from abroad if you possibly can, to bring it into the field of tourist attractions. And that has inevitably changed the character of the museum. On the other hand, the eco-museum, if it's well run, can be a very cheap place to run. Because if it's not in a building, and although you will have an interpretation centre at the middle always that will tell people what to be looking for as they go out and walk around, then you don't have the tremendous expense of maintaining and heating and cleaning a large building, which otherwise you would have to assume as a responsibility. And the attractions of it, as museums get poorer and poorer, which is happening all the time now, more and more governments, more and more local authorities are cutting their grants to museums all over Europe. So the temptation to adopt a new kind of solution is very, very great. And the eco-museum may be about to come into, I was going to say, a new world. It is almost that. The circumstances now on a European basis, well, not only on a European basis, on a worldwide basis, are as great now as they were in the mid-1960s. There is this need for financial reasons to have museums which are, in the first place, largely run by amateurs with professional help. And in the second place, museums which don't demand large running costs. And those two pressures, I think, will make eco-museums stronger in their general position. So that in general, I'm very optimistic about the future of eco-museums. I'm not very optimistic about the name. And I've tried for many years to try and discover an English name, I'm not qualified to do this in other languages, which would make this very French-sounding name more attractive. You can call them open-air museums, that's honest, but that's not the same thing as I've explained as an eco-museum. The difficulty with eco is that people don't really know what it means. In English, you confuse the first part of ecological, which of course is what it is. It's about the kind of district where the museum is, about everything within it. And also the feeling of echo, a sound which reverberates from outside and produces another version. So an echo museum is a sort of second best. It's not the original sound, but it's the echo that comes from the original sound. Now, if I'm asked to produce my own equivalent of echo museum, I suppose, as has happened in the case of Hugues de Varine, who was one of the great pioneers, he has gone over to much more the idea of community museum. He feels that the future is in a name like community.